Can you hide me from my daddy? The voice was a whisper and a hurricane all at once, too small for the 2 a.m. night, too determined to be ignored. It came from the doorway of a low-slung garage behind a bar on a country road, where a ring of motorcycles had been sleeping under tarps and oil stains. Engines hummed in the distance. Flashlight beams cut the dark like slow knives. The men inside, hard and habitual in their ways, turned. She was 6 years old, black hair braided tight at the scalp, a pink backpack clutched to her chest that seemed almost too big for her. Her sneakers were dusty. Her eyes were not. They had the kind of look that had learned too quickly how to measure danger. Razer was the first to stand. He was the club president, the scar along his cheek a pale map of a life that hadn't been kind. He moved with the deliberate patience of a man who had led others into storms more dangerous than midnight. Beside him, Chains, broad-shouldered, tattooed, and notorious within the group for settling disputes with his fists, hesitated for the first time in years. Doc, Snake, Tank, Demon sat up on grease-streaked stools. They had names that sounded like warnings. They had faces that lived those warnings. None of them expected to be reading a bedtime story by dawn. The little girl looked at each man as if searching for a face that would answer yes. "Can you hide me from my daddy?" she asked again, slower, as though the question might be redirected into a softer world. Razer knelt until he was near her level. The leather of his jacket smelled faintly of garlic and smoke. He didn't ask for credentials. He didn't ask why their garage. He kept his voice low. "Where's your mama?" he said. "She's sleeping in heaven," the girl answered, and said the words as if she had rehearsed them 1,000 times, careful not to say an untrue thing. She set the backpack between them and unzipped it with hands that trembled but did not drop. Inside were 3 things that would make the night change shape: a kitchen knife with a smudge of something dark on the blade, a small digital camera with a strip of photographs tucked into its case, and, attached to a Hello Kitty keychain, a tiny flash drive that looked like a child's toy but carried the weight of an adult's world. "These are evidence," she said, the words small and enormous at once. "He told me to take pictures, to save it till she woke up. He said if anyone found them, they'd know. I hid them." Chains reached for the knife before anyone could tell him not to, fingers gentle around the handle. He didn't brandish it. He wrapped it in a T-shirt and set it aside like it had claws. The men looked at the camera, at the flash drive, and at the girl whose chin lifted in a question that had no business being hers to ask. "Do you promise you won't let him get me?" Razer answered with a promise he had not planned to make. "No one touches you, not while we're breathing." If the scene reads like the start of something cinematic, it was because it was. An impossible alignment of innocence and intimidation, a child's courage intersecting with a band's rough compassion. The men who had been described in police files as hardened and dangerous found themselves realizing, in the span of a heartbeat, the shape of what they would risk to keep a child safe. "Call the police," someone said. It might have been Doc. The word sounded like a concession and a necessity. Razer took out his phone, thumbed the number, then paused. He was a man who knew where calls could lead. He also knew how fast decisions could get a child killed if handled wrong. He looked at the little girl. "Tell me everything," he said instead. She spoke then, in tiny sentences that felt like small, precise tools. Her mother's bruises had been hidden beneath sweaters. Photographs showed dark crescents under an eye, a torn blouse, a hand raised over a small body. The camera held images that matched the nights she described. A father staggering with rage, a hallway lit by a single bulb, a purse of cash left on a counter in a rush. She told them how her father had said the men who came with him handled the money. She said words she had been taught for safety: date, time, names, if she remembered. She could not remember all the names. She could remember the flash drive that had a picture of a ledger and a short video of a conversation she did not understand. When Razer opened the flash drive on his phone, only to see file names and a single frozen thumbnail, He felt something like a frost move under his skin. It was not the content that made him steady. It was the obviousness of what the content could become. Detailed records, photographs, and a tiny child's testimony were the sort of things that, when combined with official attention, changed the calculus of power. He didn't make decisions alone. The club had rules and loyalties. But the night made its choices in a hurry. They wrapped the camera and flash drive in clean cloth and put them in Razer's safe. They staged a corner of the garage into a place that could be called a bed, a used sleeping bag, a pillow they might once have used under different names, a ceramic mug that now held warm broth. Someone read the child a story. Someone else tightened the bolts on a door. "Stay here," Razer said to Chains, his voice stripped to an order. Chains did not say he could not do it. He answered by standing at the door, shoulders a wall, while the engines murmured beyond. Then headlights cut the black. They were close, faster than expected. 3 men stepped out of a truck into the flood of the garage light, a man with a face both familiar and foul, whose mouth shaped the little girl's name with ownership, her father, and 2 others with the blank, watchful air of men, used to men who handle things for them. Their presence made the air change. You could feel the direction of the night tilt toward danger. "Give me the drive," the father said. His voice had the thinness of someone who did not think he could be refused. "We don't have to make a scene," Razer said. There was a softness in it that could have been an attempt at de-escalation. It was also a warning. The men behind him, the club's old ghosts, shifted like the tide pulling in. The father stepped forward, hand reaching into his jacket. He was not allowed to touch the child. The men across from him formed a line, a human barricade that said without a single exhibition of malice that they would stand between a child and a hand that had only ever meant harm. What followed lasted maybe a minute and a half in real time, though it would be retold later as 90 seconds of precise orchestration. There was no theatre of gore. There was a choreography born of habit and hard-earned skill. One man moved to disarm, another to restrain, another to hold the other's hands while someone put cuffs on them. It was violent by necessity, but not by joy. The bikers used measured force, taking care to avoid harm beyond what was required to prevent harm to the child. When it ended, 3 men lay detained. The father breathing hard and angry, the associates subdued and controlled. Razer did not relish the sight. He felt an old, familiar adrenaline and a new, strange tenderness for the small body that had prompted it. The knife was wrapped and placed with the camera and the drive. Nobody celebrated. They did what had to be done. They called for the police. And then they did not leave the child alone for a second. Police came with flashes painting the garage red and blue. An officer took the child's statement in a warm tone, as trained officers did, careful with phrasing, gentle with interruptions. A federal agent would later arrive at the scene. The case was too tangled for only local hands. The flash drive was bagged and logged. The photos were catalogued. The knife was photographed and reserved as evidence. The men who had been detained were read their rights. Language like alleged and charged began to fill the air, replacing the immediate verbs of the garage with the slow machinery of justice. Emma, that was the child's name, the one the men learned and used with a kind of protective reverence, sat in Razer's lap for a while, fingers in the frayed cuff of his jacket. "Is it over?" she asked, simply. Razer kissed the top of her head. "For tonight," he said. "For tonight it's over." The police had questions that were professional and necessary. The club had questions that were practical and immediate. Who would watch the child until social services decided? When officers noted the men's criminal histories, a familiar skepticism crept into their faces. These were, after all, men with records. Who would trust them with a child? Social services moved in on their own timeline. Margaret Stevens was the social worker assigned to the case. She arrived with a badge and a suitcase of assessments and the kind of skepticism that comes from seeing hard promises fall apart. She had a policy book in her head and a checklist in one hand. In the other hand, she had a voice that had to believe in due process and systems. She looked at the garage and at the men who stood like statues of ragged armor. "We can't place a child in an environment like this," she told Razer, the words professional, the concern private. "We're not asking you to place us," Razer said. "We're asking you to let us protect her while this moves through the system. We're asking for time." Margaret's eyes moved from Razer to the child, to the slow, fist-tightening trust Emma seemed to have placed in these men. She watched Chains braid a small section of Emma's hair with a clumsy patience that softened his knuckles. She saw Doc teach her to whistle slowly, the two of them laughing at the sound when she got it. She watched men with criminal pasts folding blankets, boiling milk, standing in front of the clubhouse door at 3 in the morning like sentinels who had learned a new prayer. That is not to say the men had become saints overnight. There were rows about curfews, and rough language said that had to be apologized for. There were nights when sorrow sat at the table, and someone drank too much to forget. There were arguments about school enrollment and doctor visits. They had to child-proof parts of the clubhouse, bolt cabinets, remove tools from the accessible benches. They had to learn that protection meant more than muscle. It meant responsibility for scraped knees and homework, and the vocabulary of feelings. Margaret kept a file folder thick with notes. She insisted on a background check, on counseling, and on routine home visits. She watched a group of men teach themselves to be small in the ways a child needed. She was surprised by their competence. The way Chains learned to braid hair, how Snake sang off-key but steady, how Tank, whose reputation had preceded him on 100 dangerous nights, learned the precise measurement of a child's portion and apologized when he oversalted soup. Their tenderness was not cinematic sweetness. It was the slow, awkward redeployment of men hardened by a life onto tasks that required softness. "Why her?" someone asked. And in the question lived an accusation toward the system that had allowed the abuse and toward the men who considered themselves unfit. The answer went unspoken for a time. It lingered in the night air until Emma filled it with her own small contents, because she stayed, because she told. Investigators pursued the flash drive and the photographs with an attention that surprised the men. The drive contained scanned receipts and a ledger that suggested patterns of money moving in and out of local businesses in ways that smelled like laundering. It had a short audio clip, garbled but suggestive, of a conversation that hinted at protection payments. The photographs included images of stacks of cash and a ledger with names and numbers. Nothing in the files declared definitive guilt. The words alleged and suspected prefaced every report, but the files were enough to justify a deeper look. Federal investigators opened a formal inquiry. Arrests followed in the weeks to come, based on the compilation of evidence that began with a small girl's decision to document and hide. The club's involvement in the legal process was complicated. Men like Razer and Chains had histories that the defense and prosecution both noted. They were witnesses. They were protectors. They were also, in the eyes of the system, liabilities. The question became not only whether the father and his associates would face charges, but whether a band of ex-convicts could be guardians to a child whose future deserved stability. There were hearings. There were proposals for foster placement. There were strangers who said the garage was no place for a child. There were others who came bearing food and letters from neighbors who had seen the men with Emma on morning walks, or volunteering at the local church, or teaching children how to change a tire without swearing. Margaret's file grew thicker. She visited the club again and again, observed interactions, watched the logistics of living with a child adapt. Razer took classes on parenting made available through a local non-profit. Chains attended anger management workshops and shadowed a pediatric nurse for a morning to learn how to care for fevers. The legal moment came like a cold wind, a family court hearing where facts were weighed against instincts, where the slenderness of a girl's needs was held up against the bulk of paper that declared suitability. There sat Judge Patricia Williams, a woman whose experience had taught her to listen for the quiet truths in the room. She watched Emma in the gallery, who read a little book during the proceedings and then set it aside when called to the stand. Emma's testimony was short and clear. She spoke in the same gentle cadence she had used that first night. "My mommy is in heaven," she said, when asked who she lived with. "My daddy hurt her. He hurt me. I took pictures. I hid them because I was scared. These men took me to their garage. They put me on a bed. Razer told me I was safe. I want to live where I'm safe." There was no dramatic flourish. There was instead the force of a child's honesty. Margaret addressed the court and, to the surprise of many present, changed her recommendation. She explained that while the men had pasts, the evidence in favor of the continuity of care, the documented steps they'd taken to become guardians, and the child's attachment to them could not be dismissed lightly. She spoke of the boys' competence, of the safety plan, of ongoing supervision and support services. She advised that custody be granted to a designated guardian within the club, Razer, with court oversight and structured visitation by alternative family members if needed. Judge Williams weighed the facts, the child's preference, the social worker's recommendation, and the network of support proposed. When she rendered her decision, it was careful, bounded, and conditional. Custody would be granted to Razer, with mandatory counseling for the child and the men, regular home visits by Margaret, and a requirement that the men participate in parenting and rehabilitation programs. The court's order was not a stamp of permanent perfection. It was a framework for accountability. The relief in the room was palpable. Razer wept behind the stoic face he had kept for decades. Chains, who had once believed that feelings were a luxury, sat with hands trembling. Emma, for her part, shrugged as if a weight she had carried for too long was finally allowed to loosen. "I can sleep in my bed now," she told Razer later, a small proclamation that meant everything. What followed was the mundane miracle of reweaving a life. The clubhouse was made child-friendly. Docks of sharp tools were locked away, paint-covered crude murals, and gave way to cheerful murals painted by neighborhood kids, cabinet latches installed, medications moved to high shelves. The men learned to plan menus with nutrition in mind, to wash a child's scraped knee without a growl, to hold hands at the bus stop. Their hard edges did not disappear. They softened at the margins, enough that the child could see the difference between past deeds and present devotion. Out of necessity, and because of the publicity the case received, the club's clubhouse was soon the site of a small, intentional program called Little Warriors. It began with one child and expanded to serve others who had suffered small and hidden violences. The program taught children how to document abuse safely, photos, notes, dates, and safe contacts. It taught basic self-defense and escape plans appropriate for small bodies. It offered counseling and emergency kits, stuff Emma liked to keep in her pink backpack. The men volunteered in shifts. They taught practical skills like changing a tire and more tender things like how to tie a bow. They listened to stories the children told and learned to respond without judgment. They were not free of old demons. Chains still woke up some nights shaking. Tank sometimes disappeared for a day or two in a fog that required a friend to find him and bring him back. Demon argued bitterly about the world until finally admitting he had been afraid for the child to be taken away. They attended meetings, took classes, and accepted supervision. The accountability that had guarded the child's placement was not an intrusion, but a mirror. It showed gaps and offered ways to fill them. Investigations into the father's connections expanded. The flash drive proved crucial. Prosecutors described records and transactions that suggested a network moving money through local businesses. The language used in court filings remained careful. Alleged, suspected, indictments. Still, arrests were made. The men who had accompanied Emma's father were indicted on charges tied to suspected criminal activity. The father himself faced charges related to domestic abuse and other offenses. A federal investigation moved slowly but inexorably, aided by the tangible documentation the girl had provided and the statements that followed. The story did not end in a single courtroom. It reverberated. The men who had once run the streets as an outlaw band became a local phenomenon of a different sort. Rough men learning to read the lines on an application, to sign forms, to hold a child's hand when the nightmares came. The local paper ran a piece with caution and awe. Volunteers came asking to help with the Little Warriors program. Therapists offered pro bono sessions. Neighbors began to see the clubhouse not only as a place of whispered reputation, but as a place where scraped knees were tended and children learned to write safety cards. Emma grew. By the time she was 10, she was no longer the tiny figure filling a garage doorway at 2 in the morning. She still carried the pink backpack, though now it held crayons, a small journal, laminated emergency contact cards she had herself helped design, and a shoebox of carefully labeled photographs. The flash drive that had started it all sat in evidence storage under a case number. She knew it lived in a secure place and that it had done its work. She had ambitions no one had pushed on her, but everyone encouraged. She wanted to be a police officer when she grew up, not because she loved crime or control, but because she wanted to give kids a place to go when they needed to be believed. "I want to help other little kids who have to hide," she told Razer once, fingers tracing the scar on his cheek like a map. He hugged her and told her she could do anything. Razer, Chains, Snake, Tank, Demon and Doc were not unmade by the experience. They were altered. They created rituals, a nightly check of the children's rooms, a morning routine for school lunches, an alumni group that helped men find jobs and housing. The program grew modestly, guided by the lessons of that first night. Documentation mattered, official involvement was necessary, compassion had to be paired with accountability, and children deserved to be treated as agents of their own rescue whenever possible. There were hard days. A neighbor complained about noise. A journalist pressed for dramatics that the men refused to provide. A hearing required additional oversight. But the core of the change lasted. A child who had once asked a group of men, "Can you hide me from my daddy?" had taught a found family how to be a community. Years later, the pink backpack was a smaller piece of symbolism than an everyday object. Emma kept it in the back of her closet as a talisman. On a visit to the courthouse, she placed a small bouquet on the bench where Judge Williams had sat. She met Margaret Stevens for coffee one afternoon to thank her. Margaret had a folder that showed the trajectory of the case, the photos, the chain of custody, the hearing transcripts. She had also kept a note in her desk. "Change is messy, necessary, possible," she had written and underlined. When people asked Emma about the men who raised her, she did not give them simple answers. She spoke of mistakes and of apologies, of the way Chains could braid her hair perfectly now, of how Snake could make the worst pancake taste like breakfast in a home. She spoke of the legal papers that kept everyone honest, of counseling that gave language to hard things, and of the way the flash drive held a small ledger that had stopped a much larger harm from spreading unchecked. Her story spread not as a legend of vigilantism, but as a cautionary, hopeful tale about what happens when people refuse to let a child be invisible. It showed that unexpected protectors could become teachers, that documentation could build a bridge to justice, and that systems, if held accountable and pushed gently by human insistence, could bend toward safety. The Little Warriors program became a modest model for other communities, a combination of emergency shelter, documentation training for children, and a network of vetted guardians who were given steady oversight and access to rehabilitative services. It was not perfect. It never claimed to be. It was, however, an honest attempt to turn a raw piece of courage. A 6-year-old who photographed evidence and took a flash drive and walked into a garage at midnight. into a structure that might prevent the next child from having to do the same. On the 10-year anniversary of that night, Emma stood in the same garage, now painted in bright colors and full of children's laughter, holding a new backpack and a lined notebook. She had learned to write in a careful, neat hand. She practiced reading aloud to a circle of younger kids, her voice steady. The men sat behind her, not as a chorus of guards, but as a band of men who had learned to wait and to watch and to love. She unzipped her pink backpack, pulled out a laminated card with emergency numbers, and tucked it into the hand of a little girl who reminded her of herself. "Keep this," she said, "and tell someone." The men watched. They had once thought their lives could only lead to ruin. Instead, those lives had been rerouted. They had learned that protection included paperwork and therapy, that saving a child required calling the police and staying through the boring parts of case management. They had learned to let the law do what it could do best, and to do what the law could not, to be consistent, messy, human guardians. If you felt moved by Emma's story and the way a small child's courage reshaped a broken set of lives, consider subscribing. Stories like this remind us that protection can come from unexpected places, and that bravery, even in 6-year-old hands, can start a chain reaction of care. In the end, the moment that had held the most power was neither the takedown nor the courtroom victory. It was the small decision Emma had made in a dim hallway, to take pictures, to hold on to proof, to trust a group of strangers enough to walk into a garage at the risk of being turned away. That choice set a series of harder choices into motion, men choosing compassion over reputation, investigators following paper trails, a judge weighing a child's voice, and social workers choosing to support a non-traditional family under strict oversight. Justice, accountability, and love moved together, imperfect and necessary. The pink backpack traveled through time, filled now with crayons and emergency cards, and the knowledge that a child could be her own first protector, and that sometimes the people who seemed least likely to be heroes would rise to fill that role when called.